They continue to target me for hunting deer and other wildlife legally with all of the permits in order simply because my property line happened to border a large area of forest. They evidently thought they owned. They picked the wrong guy because I didn't just fight the fines, I ended up buying that entire forest, thousands of acres of it. And let's just say the folks in the HOA aren't having their strolls there anymore. It started innocently enough, as these things tend to do. I bought my house specifically because it was one of the few in the development that backed directly into the woods, a huge section of privately owned woodland that stretched for miles. For someone like me who finds peace and meaning in the outdoors managing wildlife populations, through ethical hunting and simply being away from the suburban noise and groomed lawns, it was perfect. I spent years familiarizing myself with those woods, learning the trails, studying the game movements. I'm conscious of regulations, state licenses, special permits for deer season, safe gun practice, respecting property lines, which I'd had surveyed when I bought the place. Everything by the book. The hunting itself always took place deep in the woods, well away from any houses, certainly well outside of the sorry boundaries of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Jurisdiction. The forest wasn't theirs. They weren't public property. They were held by an out-of-state old timber family trust. My initial neighbor interactions were fine. Most people kept to themselves. A few friendly nods here and there. The HOA was relatively subdued, largely concerned with lawn height and trash can visibility, the typical nitpicky stuff. Then Brenda Albright was elected HOA president. Brenda, a woman whose chief life experience seemed to be complaining at planning board hearings and leading the annual pet parade, suddenly had a new mission, wielding the small power of the HOA like some medieval king. She had this way of speaking a type of pinched whine, spoken with absolute certainty, that judged me from the first neighborhood meeting I attended. She seemed to believe the HOA bylaws were scripture, and she was the sole ordained interpreter. The trouble began one cold Saturday morning during deer season. I'd had a successful hunt deep in the woods, ethically harvesting a good buck well over 100 pounds mile from my property line. Surely nowhere near development I'd field, dressed it respectfully, where it fell, packed it out properly on a game cart, and returned to my garage sometime around noon, with plans to process it later. I was unloading my equipment, my cased rifle, my pack, the carefully wrapped meat in coolers, when Brenda's golf cart screeched to a halt at the end of my driveway. She popped out with an agility that belied her usual sedentary position, clutching a clipboard like a shield. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice tight with disapproval. "What is all this?" I stopped, equally startled by the belligerent tone. "Good morning, Brenda." Just back from a hunt, I waved vaguely toward the woods, managed to fill my tag. Her eyes narrowed as she searched my gear, lingering on the coolers. "Hunting. You know that's not permitted in Whispering Pines?" I said evenly. "Brenda, I wasn't hunting in Whispering Pines. I was hunting way back in the woods on the lumber company's land where it's perfectly legal, with the state licenses I have right here." I patted my jacket pocket where my license was. My activities were nowhere near the HOA property. She sniffed, looking at her clipboard as if it held divine revelations. The bylaws specifically state that activities which disrupt the peace or threaten the community are forbidden. Discharging firearms, bringing carcasses through the neighborhood, it's simply not acceptable. I felt a surge of annoyance. Brenda, the shot was fired miles away from here, posing no danger whatsoever, and processing game is a natural part of legal hunting. It's being carried out quietly and hygienically in my own garage on my own property. It doesn't violate any bylaw that I'm aware of. She waved dismissively. "Wave, the look of it is offensive to locals. We do have kids here. Take this as your first official warning. We'll be monitoring this situation." Before I could respond further, she returned to her golf cart and tore off, leaving me there with my legally harvested deer and a developing sense of incredulity. This wasn't concerning safety or bylaws. This appeared personal. It was clear Brenda just did not like hunting, and she was going to use the HOA's limited power to stop me. That first confrontation established the tone for what was to be a long, absurd, and ultimately very expensive battle, mostly for them, as it turned out. But at the time, I just felt weary already anticipating the bureaucratic nonsense. Brenda was no doubt brewing back in her war room, probably working newly drafted, poorly worded amendments to offensive displays of sporting activities, as we discussed. The peace I had sought in the woods was about to be harshly interrupted by suburban pettiness. Little did Brenda know she was pushing someone who cared about that peace, and the rights that guaranteed it far more than she could ever imagine. My connection to that forest, the space she was trying to police remotely, went beyond being recreation. It was a fundamental aspect of my decision to live there. And I wasn't going to let some power-tripping HOA president dictate my legal activities miles away from her perfectly manicured lawn. The initial warning from Brenda was not an idle threat. It was the opening salvo in a campaign of HOA-sanctioned harassment. True to her word, the surveillance began almost at once. I started to see her golf cart creeping by my house more often, especially on weekend mornings, or nights when I'd be going out or returning from the woods if I'd been hunting or just walking. Sometimes one of her bored sycophants, usually a retiree named Gary who evidently had nothing better to do, would be sitting down the street pretending to read a newspaper. It was obtrusive and just plain creepy. I continued my hunting activities, ensuring I was even more discreet, parking my truck deeper into the garage when unloading, minimizing any visible signs from the roadway. But Brenda didn't need physical evidence. Assumption and her own disapproval were enough. A week after our driveway confrontation, the first official letter arrived by certified mail, complete with the Whispering Pines HOA logo embossed at the top. It formally cited me for violating bylaw 7.14, engaging in activities detrimental to the aesthetic harmony and peaceful enjoyment of the community. The evidence cited was observation of hunting paraphernalia and reports of activity not in keeping with community standards. It came with a $100 fine and demanded immediate cessation of all hunting-related activity, despite location. I wasn't just upset about the fine, but at the deliberate vagueness and the implication that my perfectly legal off-property hobby was somehow detrimental. I immediately retrieved my copy of the HOACCRS and bylaws. I read through bylaw 7.14 and the sections corresponding to it. There was absolutely nothing explicitly forbidding hunting off HOA property. The language was subjective and was clearly added as a catch-all for things the board didn't approve of. There were clauses about discharging firearms within the development, which I'd never done, clauses about noise nuisances, again, not relevant, and clauses about property appearance. Nothing said anything about legal hunting miles away on someone else's property. I composed a calm, professional letter. I reiterated that my hunting occurred miles from the development, perfectly legally, on land not owned or controlled by the HOA. I submitted copies of my state hunting license. My deer tags a map showing the vast distance between the development and my regular hunting grounds, and I highlighted the specific paragraph of the CC rupees stating the HOA's jurisdiction ended at our property borders. I stated flatly that I had not violated bylaw 7.14, that the observation of hunting equipment on my own property was not a violation, and that I would not be paying the fine or halting my legal activities. I sent it certified mail, so I had proof it was delivered. Brenda's reply was prompt and dismissive. Another letter arrived, this time notifying me the board had reviewed my appeal and determined it was without merit. The fine was upheld. In addition, a new fine of $250 for illegal dumping of refuse loosely linked to biological material presumed to be linked to game processing. They had presented zero evidence. They were essentially convicting me on Brenda's speculation of what I had done in the privacy of my own garage after coming in from the woods. It was increasingly apparent that logic and evidence meant nothing to them. This was a power play fueled by Brenda's personal agenda. I spoke with a neighbor, Mark, who resided a few doors down. He was subdued in nature, but rolled his eyes when I mentioned Brenda. "Yeah, she's on a tear," he sighed. "Tried to cite me last month because my garden hose wasn't wrapped perfectly. Thinks she's the queen around here." Now that her husband left, Mark was not a hunter, but he agreed the HOA was historically overreaching if they were trying to police legal activity off their property. He warned me Brenda had the support of Gary and another board member, so she usually got her way. This neighborly sympathy, however slight, gave me renewed resolve. I was not quite so isolated in thinking this was absurd. I also had a brief conversation with a friend who practices real estate law. Though he did not specialize in HOA disputes, he confirmed my reading of the CC rupees, unless there was language specifically prohibiting off-property hunting or bringing legally harvested game onto one's property. The HOA's case was extremely weak. He instructed me to document everything positively, save all correspondence, including envelopes with postmarks, take time, dated photographs of my equipment being stored properly, maybe even get a statement from the game warden confirming the legality of my hunting locations and practices. He warned that HOAs can be notorious for being obstructionist and that sometime they try to win by attrition, drowning homeowners in paperwork and threats of liens. The threats started soon after. The second letter ignored my denials completely and simply added the fines together, tacking on late fees and including the HOA's power to place a lien on my property if the outstanding balance wasn't paid on time. This was a huge escalation. A lien could affect my credit, my mortgage, my future ability to sell the house. It was the HOA's nuclear option for non-compliance. They weren't just fining me anymore. They were actively threatening my financial viability and home ownership over something I had every legal right to do, miles away from their petty kingdom. The frustration was enormous, but it was quickly taking form as cold determination. They thought they could bully me into submission. They underestimated my stubbornness and my strongly held conviction in property rights, both mine and the owner of the forests. They were implicitly trying to control. Brenda's little war was going to force me in a direction she couldn't perhaps anticipate. The fight was no longer simply about hunting anymore. It was about taking a stand against unjustifiable overreach. And I started to wonder, what was the last stand I could make? The fines just kept on coming with ever more threatening letters, threatening liens and litigation. Each certified mail delivery was like another turn of the screw. My attempts at reasoned discussion were replied to form. Lettered threats of termination from the HOA board expressly dictated by Brenda. It was like attempting to argue with a brick wall, one which thought it held dominion over the entire county. Paying the fines felt wrong. It would legitimize their ridiculous overreach. Ignoring them felt risky in light of the thin threat. I required a third alternative, something that addressed the root of the problem, not the symptoms. The root, as I understood it, was the fuzzy boundary between my land, the HOA sphere of influence, and the vast woods beyond. Brenda and her cronies were acting like their authority somehow extended into those woods, or at least entitled them to punish me for what I did there. What if I used that line became crystal clear? What if the ownership of that woods wasn't some distant abstract entity but someone they couldn't intimidate? My first concrete step was the hiring of a professional land surveyor. Not just any surveyor, but a highly reputable firm with a reputation for doing complete work, particularly in boundary disputes. I wanted a bulletproof, updated survey of my property line, determining exactly where HOA property ended and the woods began. Was a few $1,000s expense, but I viewed it as an investment in ammunition for the warhead. The surveyor was out there for a couple of days with their high-tech equipment. Of course, their presence did not go unnoticed. Brenda herself drove down in her golf cart on the second day, demanding to know what was happening. I was home and intercepted her. "They're verifying my property lines, Brenda." I replied, trying to sound as innocent as possible. "So all my landscaping and fences are where they're supposed to be. Due diligence, you know?" She looked at the surveyor suspiciously. "Sounds like an unnecessary expense unless you're trying something," she muttered clearly. "Fishing being a conscientious homeowner," I replied blandly. Unlike some who seem determined to keep tabs on activity miles beyond their purview, her face clenched, but the surveyors were operating squarely within my lot, and she could not really stop them. She eventually drove off in a huff. The survey results were returned precisely as expected, corroborating my initial understanding and the lines represented on my deed. My property ended neatly at the wood's edge. The woodland tract was entirely separate. While the surveyors were working, I asked them casually about the big neighboring parcel, the forest itself. They knew the tract. It was one of the largest privately owned timberlands remaining in the area. They checked that it was owned by the Black Creek Timber Trust, operated by an executive approaching retirement several states away. They stated matter-of-factly that over the years there had been some inquiries, but largely from developers who wished to subdivide it, but the trust had long been resistant to selling, especially piecemeal. This prompted an idea if the trust was perhaps willing to sell, not so much to developers, but maybe to a conservation-oriented buyer, someone who cherished the land as it was. This led me down a trail of internet research. I spent hours digging up county property records, tax assessments, and corporate records relating to the Black Creek Timber Trust. I learned the trust had been established decades earlier. The beneficiaries were elderly or deceased, and the present executor, a man named Arthur Jenkins, was himself quite old. The oversight of several thousand acres of timberland from a distance likely represented a significant administrative task, perhaps one he wished to relinquish. The tax rolls showed the annual property taxes were substantial. Possibly the pressure was mounting to dispose of the asset. I also searched for any indication of prior offers or inquiries. Interestingly, I came across minutes of an ancient county planning meeting 5 or 6 years ago in which the Whispering Pines HOA, under a different president, had made an inquiry about buying a 50-foot buffer strip for the forest land directly behind the development. According to the minutes, their unofficial offer was laughably low and courteously rejected by the representatives of the trust at the time, who indicated not wishing to sell off small parts. Had Brenda revived this idea, was her harassment of me partly driven by an effort to somehow pressure the trust or perhaps make the zone appear beleaguered? Driving down the price for a future HOA bid, it sounded somewhat conspiratorial. But knowing Brenda's desire for control, it was not completely out of the question. She might see securing a buffer zone as her grand legacy project. My research was piecing together a puzzle: the HOA's overreach, Brenda's personality, the reality that this huge, potentially available forest tract was out there, the trust's apparent reluctance to deal with developers or lowballers. A daring, almost outrageous notion began to take shape. What if I bought the forest, the entire thing? It sounded crazy at first. We're talking thousands of acres, a multi-million-dollar venture. But the more I thought it, the less crazy it sounded. Not easy by any stretch, but maybe doable. It would be the final solution. It would cement my access and right to hunt. It would put an absolute legal end to the HOA's harassment of my activities there. And the sweet, sweet irony it would give me: dominion over the very land Brenda seemed to desire. The fines, the threats, the minor harassment, they all felt like minor annoyances compared to the potential of this grand counter move. My record-keeping continued. The survey results were recorded diligently, but my focus was shifted away from defense into active strategic planning. The HOA thought they were backing me into a corner. They had no idea they were forcing me to purchase the entire landscape. Purchasing the Black Creek Timber Trust land evolved from an insane dream to an all-encompassing enterprise. It wasn't akin to the acquisition of a car or even a house. This was a high-stakes, high-risk endeavor with large amounts of capital and sensitive negotiation. The first hurdle was monetary, thousands of acres even. Raw timberland was a price far beyond my liquid cash reserves. I spent weeks running my finances, savings, investments, retirement accounts. I had a few other small assets that I might be able to sell. It still wouldn't be nearly enough. Not even close. I researched financing options, spoke discreetly with a commercial loan officer at my bank who did big land deals. It was frightening. Banks are wary of lending large sums of money for non-income generating land, unless there's a good plan for timbering or development, neither of which was my primary goal. My goal was preservation, personal use, and frankly, spite for the HOA. Then I thought of my old college roommate, Dave. Dave had made a good living for himself in the tech industry, and more importantly, he was a die-hard conservationist and outdoorsman, someone who would appreciate my annoyance with suburban sprawl and bureaucratic overreach. We'd stayed in touch every now and then, taking hunting or fishing trips together. I brought the subject up with him cautiously over a weekend camping trip. Well out of earshot of prying ears, I laid out the whole situation: the HOA harassment, the woodland property, the aging trust, the potential opportunity. To my surprise, Dave didn't laugh. He listened intently, nodding along. "So you want to buy a forest to get revenge on your HOA?" "Karen," he asked, a grin spreading across his face. "Partially, I admit, but also to preserve it, prevent it from being yet another housing development guarantee. Our access for hunting, hiking forever. The conservation element appealed to him as much as the revenge plot. He told us he'd been looking for a significant long-term investment that was aligned with his environmental principles. We spent the rest of the weekend brainstorming. We could form an LLC pool, our funds potentially bring in one or two other solid like-minded investors. If we had to, Dave had the money, I didn't, and I had the local knowledge, the passion, and had already done the initial legwork. We set about forming a partnership with the express intention of buying the Black Creek property. This partnership gave us the desired teeth. We hired a lawyer specializing in complicated real estate transactions and conservation easements. Our lawyer made the initial confidential contact with Arthur Jenkins, president of the Black Creek Timber Trust. We didn't mention the HOA problem. Our angle was merely that of a private investment firm seeking to purchase and hold the timberland parcel in its entirety. Jenkins, as I had surmised, was indeed older and increasingly weary of managing the large property. Our timing was fortunate. He acknowledged the trust was weighing its options for divestment. He seemed genuinely pleased that our stated interest was in preservation and not in immediate logging or subdividing. He spoke of having fought off numerous vulture-like developer proposals over the years and seemed wary of lowball proposals. This played to our benefit. We were not interested in flipping it. We wanted to be long-term stewards. The negotiation process was contentious and prolonged, lasting several months. There were lengthy surveys, environmental evaluations, timber assessments needed for valuation, even if immediate harvest wasn't on the agenda, and lots of legal back and forth. Dave and I went out to meet with Jenkins, in person, building rapport and reassuring him of our intentions. He was sharp, experienced, and negotiated a hard deal. But ultimately, he seemed to want to sell to us more than to other interested purchasers. During this entire time, I had to maintain complete confidentiality within the neighborhood. The HOA fines kept piling up. The menacing letters kept coming. I paid one or two of the smaller, earlier fines under protest, purely as a tactical measure to slow the lien process while the forest purchase was in progress. It irked me to send them a check, but my lawyer advised it might discourage them from moving to immediate legal action before we were ready. Brenda was blissfully unaware of the storm approaching. She accepted my partial payment as an indication I was finally cracking from the pressure. She even had the audacity to pass a smug comment to me one afternoon when I was collecting my mail. "Nice to see you're coming to understand the rules, Mr. Miller. It's for the good of the community." I just smiled tightly at her, and not a word came out. Within, I was imagining the look on her face when she found out I was the owner of the thousands of acres backing up to her precious community. There was a near miss. A young lawyer who represented the trust needed some county zoning information and mistakenly dialed the Whispering Pines HOA office, believing they were a local governmental office. Luckily, the standard office administrator said, "Not Brenda," and simply directed the attorney to the correct county department. If Brenda had taken that call, she would have put two and two together. But fate, it seemed, was on my side. At last, after months of negotiation, due diligence, and hair-raising financial arrangements that stretched Dave and me to the breaking point, the deal was done, the contracts were signed, the funds transferred. The LLC Dave and I formed was now the rightful owner of the entire Black Creek Timber Trust property, thousands of acres of forest abutting the entire rear of the Whispering Pines development were ours. The biggest keep-out sign imaginable was going up. Figuratively and literally. Phase 1 of Operation Forest Fortress was finished. Phase 2, the reveal, was ready to start. The ink was barely dry on the closing documents when I initiated Phase 2, Operation Boundary Enforcement. The sheer scale of owning that much land was still sinking in, a combination of excitement and the weight of responsibility. But my first order of business was clear: securing the perimeter and delivering a sorely needed message to the Whispering Pines HOA and its nosy president, Brenda Albright. The first step was signage. Not just any signs, but huge, professionally constructed, highly visible signs that did not leave anything to misinterpretation. I had about 50 of them, made of heavy-gauge metal, emblazoned with bold white letters on a dark background. Private property, posted no trespassing, Hunting, hiking, camping, ATV riding, and all other access strictly prohibited violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Property owned by Iron Creek Holdings LLC, crucially at the bottom of many key signs posted near the main informal access points leading from the HOA development, I added a very specific line. Access is expressly forbidden for all residents, guests, and affiliates of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I wanted zero ambiguity. The previous owner might have allowed decades of permissive use, creating an assumption of access on the neighbor's part. That assumption needed to be soundly broken. More than that weekend, with Dave's help and a couple of burly friends under oath of secrecy, we embarked on a strategic signposting campaign. We traced the property line along the development by GPS and installed signs at about every 100 yards where they would be most easily seen. We focused particularly on the same well-worn paths that originated in the backyards into the wooded trails where homeowners walked. Their dogs played with their children and strolled their leisurely nature walks by the very individuals whose HOA board had decided my nearness to those woods, miles further and no less objectionable. We drove thick metal stakes into the ground, firmly bolting the signs into place. It was good work, every blow of the post, driver a small victory. The immediate response from the few neighbors who were out in their yards was confusion. A few waves, questioning looks. We smiled, waved back, and kept working. No explanation forthcoming yet. The signs would speak for themselves soon enough. The real fireworks started Monday morning. I made sure that I was working from home in position with a good view of one of the prime former access trails. Along around 9 a.m., Brenda Albright strode down the path, clipboard in hand, clearly on one of her neighborhood patrol forays. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the brand new shiny sign planted squarely in front of the path entrance. Her face went through an incredible series of contortions: confusion, squinting, disbelief, and then righteous indignation. She actually reached out and poked the sign as if it were a mirage. Then she spun around, scanning the area, and spotted me leaning on my back porch with a coffee in hand. She rushed across the lawns in between, no doubt breaking a couple of bylaws herself in her haste, and stood at the edge of my property line a few feet away from where the new boundary line officially began. "What does this mean?" she shrieked, wagging a trembling finger at the sign. "Whoever put this up, this is community access land. You can't just close it off." I took a slow sip of coffee. "Good morning, Brenda. Actually, it's not community access land. It hasn't been for, well, since last Friday afternoon." Technically, her jaw worked silently for a moment. "What are you talking about? The Timber Trust owns that land. We've always used these trails." "Correction," I said, keeping my voice steady and level. "The Timber Trust sold that property. It's now owned by a private investment group." I paused for a fact. An investment group of which I am the managing partner. I let that hang in the air. Brenda's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally dawning horror as the implication hit her. You bought the entire forest." The words were a choked whisper. "That's right, Brenda. All several thousand acres of it, the same land you were so concerned I'd be using legally. Now it's mine, ours." I corrected, making a sweeping motion with my arm out towards the forest. "And as the new owners, we've chosen to exercise our property rights and restrict access, especially," I added, looking her straight in the eye, "to residents of the Whispering Pines. Oh, in light of the already demonstrated disrespect for property lines and legal activities exhibited by its leadership." She stuttered, blushing. "You can't do this. There have to be easements. We have rights." "No, Brenda, you don't," I said firmly. "We did diligent title searches. There are 0 recorded easements granting access to the HOA or its members through this property. Any access previously was strictly permissive, granted by the prior owners, and that permission is hereby revoked. These signs are legally enforceable. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I pulled out a copy of the newly recorded deed from my pocket. The official stamps, the legal descriptions, the name of our LLC. It was irrefutable. She took it, scanned it desperately, her face paling. This is outrageous. You did this just to spite us." "My motives are my own, Brenda," I said coolly. "But let's just say the HOA's constant harassment about my perfectly legal off-property activities gave me a lot of inspiration." You wished you had control over what went on near those woods. Congratulations. You pushed someone to purchase the woods themselves. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd ask you to observe the property line. You are currently trespassing on HOA common ground, but take one step further. I nodded toward the sign she'd been harassing, and you'll be trespassing on my property. She stared at me, utterly speechless, for perhaps the first time in her life. Then, with a strangled noise of rage and defeat, she turned and nearly ran back in the direction of her golf cart, the deed still clutched in her hand. The grapevine and whispering pines must have exploded that day. That afternoon, I saw little clusters of neighbors gathering around the signs, pointing, talking, looking in the direction of my house. The woods they had taken for granted. Their playground backyard was suddenly emphatically off limits. The HOA's campaign against me had backfired in the most spectacular possible way. They weren't just powerless to stop my hunting. Their actions had directly resulted in the elimination of all access to the woods for the entire community. The irony was thick enough to be tasted, and this was just the beginning. Enforcement would be the next hurdle. The posting of the signs and the showdown with Brenda were just the opening act. The real challenge would be enforcing the new reality. Whispering Pines residents had enjoyed unrestricted access to those woods for decades, and habits, especially those founded on perceived rights. Die-hard Dave and I knew that simply putting up signs would not be enough. We needed active enforcement by the law. First, we invested in technology. We strategically installed a network of high-resolution, motion-activated trail cameras covering the main former points of entry and other likely spots where people might try to sneak in. These were not your run-of-the-mill security cameras. They were weather-sealed units designed for wildlife monitoring with features of capturing clear photos during the day or night and transmitting them to our phones as alerts. We also issued official notices. Our lawyer sent a registered letter to the Whispering Pines HOA board, officially informing them of the change of ownership, reiterating the no trespassing rule with a special provision regarding HOA residents, and advising that any infringement would be legally prosecuted. We included copies of the deed and the survey map. There could be no plausible deniability for the board or the residents they represented. Predictably, the first several days saw many attempts to ignore the signs, dog walkers pretending they hadn't seen them, teenagers looking for a shortcut, even a pair of elderly residents who seemed to believe that their long-standing habit entitled them to grandfathered rights. Our cameras captured it all. For the initial few incidents with adults clearly attempting to challenge the boundaries, I chose a firm but polite course of action. I interrupted a pair walking their labradoodle along some 50 yards past a very noticeable sign. "Folks, excuse me," I called out, steps bringing me towards but staying on my side of the property line. "You folks seem to have missed the sign back there. This is private property now, and it's posted against trespassing." They seemed taken aback. "Oh, we've been walking here for years," objected the woman. "I know that," I replied patiently, "but there are new property owners, and the policy regarding access has changed. The previous owner allowed access. We do not. I need you to please return to the HOA common area." They complained but complied, pulling their dog onto the manicured grass. The encounter with Gary, Brenda's faithful ally on the board, was less cordial. I got a camera shot of him deliberately stepping over a down log right next to a sign and going down a trail. I moved forward to confront him. "Gary," I said, my voice firm, "turn around. You know you're trespassing." He stopped, puffing himself up. "Now look here, this is ridiculous. Brenda told us you were doing this just to be stubborn." "We're going to fight this fight." "What, Gary?" I asked calmly. "My right as a property owner to control who comes onto my property while you're standing steadfast on it, defying the law. The same law you as an HOA board member ought to keep within your own neighborhood." I held up my phone with a clear picture from the trail camera. "This is being documented, by the way, and I have video of you knowingly ignoring the posted sign. Turn around now or my next call is to the sheriff's department to report a trespasser." His bluff fell flat quickly. He was red-handed, muttering threats of lawyers and HOA action. He retreated the way he had come. The situation of unsupervised children and teenagers was more tricky. We did not wish to involve law enforcement with minors, if possible in those cases, caught on film. We forwarded the pictures and a warning letter to the HOA board via our attorney, insisting they warn the parents and ensure it didn't happen again, reminding them of the liability issues involved in having someone hurt while trespassing. This approach seemed to work. The incidence of kids getting into the woods diminished significantly after the first several notices had been sent out. The real test came about 2 weeks later. Brenda, perhaps thinking that sufficient time had passed or that I wouldn't have the guts to follow through on it, decided to organize a protest walk. She organized 5 or 6 sympathetic neighbors and deliberately walked past one of the conspicuous signs onto a clearly marked trail, allegedly to investigate the illegal blockage of community access. The trail camera immediately alerted me. This time I didn't hesitate. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency number, reported an ongoing trespassing incident involving multiple individuals who had ignored posted notice and verbal warnings, citing my previous encounter with Gary, a member of the group who had requested that an officer be dispatched. A sheriff's deputy arrived in about 15 minutes. I met him at the road, briefly discussed the situation, showed him the deed of ownership, the clear signage, and the live video on my phone from the trail camera of Brenda and her group still defiantly on my property. The deputy's side fairly seasoned with HOA disputes, but the law was clear. He walked down the walk, came up to the group, and informed them that they were in fact trespassing on private property. Brenda launched into a rant about historic use and communal rights. The deputy interrupted her politely but firmly explained the distinction between permissive use and legal easement, or lack thereof, and informed them that the property owner wished to press charges if they did not leave immediately. Confronted with the real possibility of being issued trespassing citations, the protest dissolved instantly. Brenda and her group withdrew back onto HOA territory, faces a combination of anger and humiliation. The deputy obtained everybody's names and issued written warnings that future occurrences would result in charges. News of the sheriff being called spread like wildfire through Whispering Pines. It became very clear that the woods were indeed closed, and that the new owner wasn't joking about enforcement. The internal HOA politics began to radically shift. Neighbors who had either supported Brenda or at least tolerated her were now furious with her. Their de facto access to the woods, something they valued, was not present, and they rightly identified Brenda's aggressive campaign against me as the catalyst. I heard from Mark, my compassionate neighbor, that the recent HOA board meeting was explosive. Residents demanded answers from Brenda on why she had opened up this can of worms. Accusations were hurled. Gary allegedly looked sheepish, while Brenda attempted to defend herself, blaming me entirely for being unreasonable. Her support among the board began to erode. The HOA even retained their lawyer to review the situation, most likely at great expense, only to be told the same thing. The LLC owned the land free and clear. There were no easements and no trespassing. Enforcement was perfectly legal. They had absolutely no recourse. My hunting it continued uninterrupted, now taking place entirely on land that I co-owned. I could venture miles into my woods, set up my deer stand in peace and quiet, without a trace of fear of HOA interference. The threatening letters ceased. The fines vanished from my account portal as though they never were. Brenda wouldn't meet my gaze when we crossed paths. The feeling of vindication was enormous, but it wasn't solely triumphant. It was peaceful. The endless stress of the conflict, the bureaucratic warfare. It was all gone, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in my own forest. Owning that forest wasn't revenge anymore. It was purchasing peace, holding a portion of nature, and creating an impenetrable boundary against petty tyranny. It cost a lot of money, time, and emotional energy. But standing on a ridge looking out across thousands of acres of protected woodland, knowing it was safe from both developers and HOA Chirons, absolutely works.